talk today is on Roosevelt's wartime policies of unconditional surrender and the Morgenthal Plan. In my opinion, there were three American presidents who achieved the status of being American Caesars. These were Lincoln, Wilson, and Franklin Roosevelt. In the case of each one, it was the war that occurred during their respective administration and the way they deceitfully involved the American government in that war, and also the way they conducted the war. And in the case of Wilson and Roosevelt, the way they tried to achieve the peace that primarily made them into being the American Caesars. The favorable mythology continues to this day in regard to Abraham Lincoln, partly because he was assassinated and became a martyr, but also because the war itself has been mythologized into a war to abolish slavery rather than to keep the South from getting a lower tax rate and injuring northern business. Mythology also continues with Franklin Roosevelt today, largely because the general public still perceives that Pearl Harbor was a truly surprise attack not provoked by Roosevelt, and that the war had a great result in that it stopped the tyranny of Hitler. There's never any mention about what we did in America in regard to Stalin and how we helped to create a worse tyranny with communism through the war and the peace terms. However, in regard to Wilson, one of the great periods of historical revisionism occurred after World War I. And to a great degree, the truth was told about Wilson and the Treaty of Versailles, although it's not often stated today. But the great historians took Wilson apart after World War I, and so he has a lesser status among the three American Caesars. In my chapter, one of my chapters in Reassessing the Presidency, I relate the story about Franklin Roosevelt in Pearl Harbor, and I comment upon an interesting meeting that occurred during the peace negotiations following World War I. There was a meeting of the representatives of the British and American government who was negotiating the treaty at the Majestic Hotel in Paris. Occurred on May 30, 1919. And at that time, it was agreed that the organization would be formed, or two organizations would be formed, to continue to promote the Anglo-American interest, especially as to foreign policy. Therefore, in the same year, 1919, the British formed the Royal Institute for International Affairs, which continues to this day. 2 years later, in 1921, key Americans created the Council on Foreign Relations, which continues to this day. In the excellent book entitled Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, there's a very important comment on the Council on Foreign Relations by the great historian Charles Beard, wherein he comments on one of the purposes of the organization as follows, and he's writing this after World War II, but talking about the purpose of the organization. Quote, "The Rockefeller Foundation and the Council on Foreign Relations intend to prevent, if they can, a repetition of what they call in the vernacular the debunking journalistic campaign following World War I. Translated into precise English, this means that journalists or other persons, they do not want journalists or other persons to examine too closely and to criticize too freely the official propaganda and official statements relative to our basic aims and activities during World War II. In short, they hope that, among other things, the policies and measures of Franklin D. Roosevelt will escape in the coming years the critical analysis, evaluation, and exposition that befell the policies and measures of Woodrow Wilson and the Entente Allies after World War I." End quote. So the purpose, one of the main purposes of the Council on Foreign Relations was to prevent an examination of Roosevelt's policies and the debunking of those policies as occurred with Woodrow Wilson. And to a great extent, the Council on Foreign Relations has been fairly successful. But my purpose today is to continue to re-examine the Roosevelt administration in an attempt to bring to light the real truth of World War II, which has become known as the last good war, in which incidentally resulted in the death of over 400,000 American soldiers and 670,000 were wounded. I'm going to concentrate, however, on only two policies that were very destructive of liberty and were instituted by Franklin Roosevelt. These are the policies of unconditional surrender and the Morgenthau Plan that Roosevelt proposed for the peace terms in World War II. However, these specific policies are part of a much larger picture, which fit into a pattern of disaster for America in the two world wars fought in the 20th century. Therefore, by way of introduction, I want to make some preliminary comments. Most military historians would agree, I think, that the purpose of war is not merely to win the war, but also to create a more stable peace after the war than that which existed before. America won military victories in World War I and II, but lost the peace in both. The whole 20th century is the bloodiest century in the whole history of mankind as a result of these wars and the murderous, totalitarian governments which came out of these wars. The growth and development of the Nazi and communist governments were primarily the result of the ill-advised and fallacious peace terms. Pat Buchanan, in one of his articles in the American Conservatives for April 21, 2003, concludes with this statement, quote, "As was true throughout the 20th century, America's problems arise not with the onset of war, but with the armistice and the onset of peace, which all too often have simply prepared the ground for the next war," end quote. This statement agrees with the opinions expressed by George F. Kennan, one of America's foremost policy experts, as shown in the first two essays of his 1996 book entitled At a Century's Ending, which reflect his ideas on looking back at the whole 20th century. Kennan states that World War I resulted in the destruction of the German and Russian governments, which were then replaced by the totalitarian regimes of Nazism and communism, respectively. He considers the harsh and larcenous Versailles Treaty as the cause of World War II and the political success of Hitler. He then states that the consequences of the peace terms of World War II created the threat of the Soviet Union and 50 years of turmoil thereafter. So Kennan fully supports the conclusion reached by Pat Buchanan. One of the best writers on World War II was Hanson Baldwin, who covered the war for the New York Times. After the war, he wrote a book entitled Mistakes of the War, which was published in 1949. He states that the basic fallacy was that America and Britain should not have entered World War II at all, but should have left Soviet Russia and Germany to fight it out. He states this, quote, "There's no doubt whatsoever that it would have been in the best interest of Britain, the United States, and the world to have allowed and indeed to have encouraged the world's two great dictatorships to fight each other to a frazzle. Such a struggle, with its resulting weakening of both communism and Nazism, could not but have aided in the establishment of a more stable peace. It would have placed the democracies in the supreme power of the world instead of elevating one totalitarianism at the expense of another. The great opportunity for the democracies was establishing a stable peace came on June 22, 1941, when Germany invaded Russia. But we muffed the chance," end quote. I'm going to show you how the policy of unconditional surrender also prevented another chance for us to turn the war into merely a battle of Germany without Hitler against Stalin and communism. Baldwin's alternative proposal is virtually the same that Harry Truman said after the war. Truman said we should have tried to help either Hitler or Stalin, whichever was losing, so that they would each kill each other off. However, we got into the war through Roosevelt's subterfuge at Pearl Harbor. And Baldwin then goes on to label mistakes made after we entered the war, and I've added a couple. First, Baldwin states perhaps the biggest political mistake of the war was the unconditional surrender policy, which was an open invitation to unconditional resistance. And he states, quote, "It probably discouraged the opposition to Hitler and probably lengthened the war, cost us lives, and helped to lead to the present abortive peace," end quote. It also lengthened the war against Japan unnecessarily from January 1945 to September 1945, showing that the atomic bombs need not have been dropped in August of 1945. Secondly, Baldwin leaves out the mistake of the Morgenthau Plan, because not until recently did people really know that it was fully implemented. But of course, it did not go by that name at the time. I'll show you the disastrous effects of that policy also. And basically that plan was to make Germany into an agricultural country and transfer most of the industrial power to the Soviet Union through actual transfers of whole factories and equipment. A third mistake was to pour Lend-Lease money and material into Soviet Russia. But also it was a mistake, if you were going to use Lend-Lease, we should have attached conditions to the receipt by the Russians. Roosevelt should have put conditions on Lend-Lease by requiring Stalin to abide by the Atlantic Charter, which Stalin actually signed, and which stated that there would be no acquisition of territory or other countries by the participants of the war. Stalin not only took over Eastern Europe, but expanded into Asia in violation of the principles of the Atlantic Charter. A fourth mistake was getting Russia into the war with Japan. In return for its 6-day participation in the war with Japan, Russia acquired tremendous lend-lease money and equipment, and at the same time acquired territory and influence in Manchuria, got the Kuril Islands back from Japan, and basically brought communism forcibly into China and Korea. A fifth mistake was made at the Cairo conference by Roosevelt requiring Chiang Kai-shek to take communists into his cabinet. And finally, a sixth huge mistake was the failure to follow the plan of Churchill to invade Eastern Europe through the Balkans, thereby bringing British and American forces into Eastern Europe to protect them from the oncoming Russian army, and also to protect Germany from being overrun by the communists. Instead, Roosevelt decided to go with the plan favored by Stalin, which was the joint invasion by England and America through Normandy, France. This allowed Russia to overrun Eastern Europe and take over a great part of Germany. So this gives you the big picture of how Roosevelt mismanaged the war with his war and peace policies. An American diplomat by the name of William C. Bullitt, who was closely connected to Roosevelt and was his ambassador to France before the war, saw these tragic developments, and he stated, quote, "While our armed forces were fighting with superb skill and courage, our foreign policy was being handled with ignorant and reckless disregard of the vital interest of the American people." End quote. Roosevelt knew at the time he entered the war on the side of Stalin and communism that Stalin had already murdered over 10 million of his own people, while Hitler had only murdered 100. We had an ambassador in Russia that went to the show trials and knew of the terror and knew of the starvation and all that was going on with the crimes of Stalin, and that was reported to Roosevelt. Furthermore, Stalin had already invaded Finland, thereby causing Soviet Russia to be kicked out of the League of Nations. Stalin also invaded Poland in September of 1939 along with Hitler, but England and France only declared war on Germany. Roosevelt had also recognized Soviet Russia in 1933 as a true government, whereas other nations had treated the communists rightfully as criminals. Roosevelt also surrounded himself with direct communist agents throughout the war who made critical decisions, and I'm going to elaborate on that toward the end of the talk. In 1943, before Roosevelt first met Stalin at Tehran, he had a conversation with Ambassador William Bullitt, who reported that Roosevelt stated the following, quote, "I have just a hunch that Stalin doesn't want anything but security for his country, and I think that if I give him everything I possibly can and ask nothing in return, that is, noblesse oblige, he won't try to annex anything, and he will work for world democracy and peace." End quote. Finally, George Crocker, in his excellent book entitled Roosevelt's Road to Russia, he states, quote, "Nor is there any mystery about how the Soviet Empire expanded during and soon after World War II, to the point where 800 million people were under its rule instead of the pre-war 170 million. This shows the giant miscalculations and the tragic decisions that Roosevelt made in World War II, which is grossly mischaracterized as the last good war. In criticizing Roosevelt and getting America into the war and thereafter his policies on war and peace, I want to make it clear that I'm not advocating either pacifism, isolationism, or unilateral disarmament. There are just wars for which a country must be well prepared, and you will see this in Murray Rothbard's chapter in the book The Cost of War, where he writes about the two just wars in American history. Also, the term isolationism should be distinguished from what I'm advocating, which is non-interventionism. The great historian Charles Beard saw that joining the economy with the military or political force produced war. Beard, however, did not believe in a free market, and he saw government and the economy as necessarily connected. Therefore, in order to have peace, he advocated isolationism, which was withdrawing into a fortress America to avoid war. What Ludwig von Mises advocated, and I agree with, is the traditional and original American policy of non-interventionism. That is, global trade through free market with all countries, but without the support of the military, the CIA, or any other political force. Now, with that introduction, let's discuss the Roosevelt policy of unconditional surrender, which Roosevelt proposed for all three of our alleged enemies, Germany, Japan, and Italy. The first public disclosure of this policy was announced by Roosevelt at the first summit, which was held in Casablanca. Stalin was invited, but refused to come, so it was merely between Churchill and Roosevelt. On January 23, 1943, the day before the policy was announced to the press, Elliott Roosevelt, the son of the president, states in his book entitled As He Saw It, that he was present with Churchill and, of course, the ever-present Harry Hopkins and his father during the luncheon. Without any prior consultation with Churchill, Roosevelt proposed the policy. Elliott Roosevelt states, quote, "For what it is worth, it can be recorded that it was Father's phrase, that Harry Hopkins took an immediate and strong liking to it, and that Churchill, while he slowly munched a mouthful of food, thought, frowned, thought, finally grinned, and at length announced, 'Perfect.' And I can see just how Goebbels and the rest of them will squeal," end quote. Roosevelt then responded to Churchill by stating, quote, "Of course, it's just the thing for the Russians. They couldn't want anything better. Unconditional surrender. Uncle Joe might have made it up by himself," end quote. Churchill was in no position to object because he was completely dependent upon America in helping Britain in the war militarily and financially through the Lend-Lease program. However, the doctrine of unconditional surrender was in direct contradiction to assurances the British government made in public speeches and in private conversations in 1939 and 1940, when it was stated that if Germany would rid itself of Hitler, this would be an acceptable basis for peace talks. While it's possible that the idea of a harsh peace did come from Stalin through Harry Hopkins, Stalin objected strongly to the public announcement of the policy and stated that the Germans should remove Hitler and then negotiate with the Russians. He stated he had no quarrel with the German people. Stalin used false propaganda of promising an easy peace to the Germans if they would overthrow Hitler. On several occasions, when Roosevelt was asked by advisors to revise or to completely eliminate the policy, he staunchly refused and stated on several occasions he did not want to make the mistake that was made with the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. Roosevelt stated it was a grave mistake to have promised the Germans in World War I that a peace treaty would be crafted according to Wilson's 14 points. And then after the Germans agreed to this and laid down their arms, they were instead forced into a harsh treaty. Roosevelt admitted that this, quote, stab in the back gave Hitler one of the main issues that allowed him to gain political power. It's important to pause here and look at this incident referred to by Roosevelt because it's essential to understanding why World War I led to World War II and how Hitler acquired political power. America's entry into World War I drastically changed the balance of power, so it was obvious that Germany could not win. So the Kaiser's government wrote a letter to President Wilson dated October 3, 1918, appealing for an armistice and peace negotiations to be conducted on the basis of President Wilson's 14 points, which he had announced on January 8, 1918, and which would not have been a harsh peace treaty on Germany. Wilson then consulted for 1 month with the Allies, England and France, about the October 3 letter. And finally, with the agreement of all three Allies, American Secretary of State Robert Lansing wrote a letter dated November 5, 1918, answering the Germans on behalf of all three Allies, stating that the peace would be negotiated and concluded on the basis of Wilson's 14 points. This November 5, 1918 letter is rarely mentioned in any history book, but it is what is known as the Pre-Armistice Agreement. Finally, the actual armistice was signed 6 days later on November 11, 1918. At that point, Germany laid down its arms, gave up the territory it had conquered, and went back to Germany, which had not been invaded. Instead of abiding by the 14 points and stopping all aggression, England continued its sea blockade up until Germany signed the peace treaty in June 1919. This blockade starved to death hundreds of thousands of German civilians. In this way, the Versailles Treaty was forced upon the new German government, which had replaced the Kaiser's government. It was absolutely a vindictive and unfair treaty, which completely violated the 14 points. It was not a negotiated treaty, but a forced treaty, since Germany was not even allowed to be present while the terms were discussed. The Weimar Republic of Germany continued to enforce this Versailles Treaty against the wishes of the German people, helping to make this government very unpopular in Germany. Also, the German people were faced with a takeover of communism from within Germany and from Soviet Russia. So one man arose from the ashes of World War I and promised to set aside the Versailles Treaty and defeat communism, and that was Adolf Hitler. He had the political issues which caused the Nazi Party to become the most popular political party in Germany and allowed him to gain power through the democratic and constitutional process. Hitler was made chancellor as a result of the Nazi Party being the major party. And when President Hindenburg died, Hitler then joined the office of president to his position of chancellor. Then, under the emergency powers contained in the German Constitution at that time and was available to him as president, he assumed dictatorial powers and dissolved Parliament, which was a constitutional act available to him in case of emergency. People who later formed a part of the German resistance movement to Hitler had first supported him because he was going to set aside the unfair treaty and fight communism. The treaty had limited Germany to only 100,000 armed forces and prevented them from having any air force or navy. Germany was exposed to Soviet communism and to the large French army without any defenses, and the vast majority of the Germans knew that the treaty must be set aside. In fact, key people who negotiated the treaty for the Allies openly stated that the treaty was too harsh and needed to be revised. And Wilson even stated that the League of Nations needed to revise the treaty soon after he left Paris. The true explanation of Munich is that that was a revision of the treaty, which was necessary and advisable. Then the unfair treatment of Germany is what Roosevelt was talking about when he said that he was going to avoid the stab in the back this time. But the real reason of Versailles, real lesson of Versailles, is that a harsh treaty itself should be avoided. Not just the false promises and the terms should be negotiated and not dictated in order to create a more stable peace after the war than that which existed before. Ralph Raico mentioned a while ago about the Congress of Vienna in 1814, which ended the Napoleonic Wars, and that's a good example of a good attempt to arrive at a peace treaty to create a more stable peace, which basically it did for about 100 years in Europe. It was negotiated with all parties present, and it was not dictated to France, which lost the war. This is the lesson that Roosevelt did not learn, and the great mistake he made in forcing the vengeful unconditional surrender policy on America's alleged enemies in World War II. The unconditional surrender policy is rarely seen in history as a way to conclude a war. The most famous example, however, being the ruthless policy in which Rome conquered Carthage. The word Carthaginian became an adjective to describe a harsh peace. Now, going back to the Casablanca Conference, on January 24, 1943, the day following the luncheon with Churchill, Roosevelt announced the policy of unconditional surrender to the astonished press. He did this in a casual manner as though he just thought of it. Then he recalled that during the American Civil War that General U.S. Grant acquired the nickname Unconditional Surrender, which is said to stand for the letters U.S. in his name. Roosevelt stated he was going to use the same unconditional surrender terms that Grant had forced upon Lee at Appomattox. Again, Roosevelt demonstrated his ignorance of history. Grant got his name Unconditional Surrender from the Battle of Fort Donelson in Tennessee. And it is not unusual for, during a war for an individual battle to require unconditional surrender. However, it's highly inadvisable and rarely seen that you settle a war on unconditional surrender. In fact, Grant gave Lee such generous terms for surrender at Appomattox that when Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia, that it was challenged by the administration. Grant allowed the Southern soldiers and officers to keep their horses and mules and the officers to keep their weapons. He shared the rations of the Union soldiers with the Southern soldiers, many of whom were practically starving. He allowed the Southerners to go back home with the understanding that they would take an oath of loyalty to the Union government. The actual terms for surrender that were offered and discussed by the North and the South occurred at Hampton Roads, Virginia in January 1865 when Abraham Lincoln and his Secretary of State William Seward met with Alexander Stephens, the Confederate Vice President. Lincoln stated that if the South would rejoin the Union, there would be no harsh peace and no reconstruction, and the South could simply return to the Union with its elected representatives. Lincoln stated that the 13th Amendment was still pending in Congress and that this would abolish slavery, but if the South returned, they would have the votes to defeat it and they could protect slavery. Stephens, on behalf of the South, stated the South was not interested in protecting slavery and they simply wanted their independence and refused the offer. Now let's go to the other policy, peace policy of Roosevelt, and that is the one that only applied to Germany, and that's the Morgenthau Plan. The Morgenthal Plan is named for Roosevelt's Secretary of Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, Jr. Morgenthal's father, Henry Sr., was a very large financial contributor to both the Wilson and Roosevelt campaigns for president. The large Morgenthau estate adjoined the Roosevelt estate along the Hudson River, so they were neighbors. Henry Jr. was the only Jewish person in the cabinet of Roosevelt, but he was Roosevelt's closest associate and friend in the cabinet. Henry Jr. was very undistinguished and had accomplished little prior to being named by Roosevelt as Secretary of Treasury, a position he was uniquely unqualified to fill. In August of 1944, Morgenthau Jr. took a trip to England to see General Eisenhower, who led the American forces in the Normandy invasion and the European campaign. He took with him his top aide in the Treasury Department, Harry Dexter White, who was later to be definitely determined to be a communist spy. Also, that was not the real name of Harry Dexter White. His parents were Jacob and Sarah Wheat, W-E-I-T, who had immigrated from Russia. The purpose of the trip was to discuss the post-war treatment of Germany and to draw up a plan for how this was to be carried out. Morgenthau determined at the meeting with Eisenhower that the general also supported a policy of vengeance against the Germans to punish them severely. Eisenhower, in fact, collaborated with Morgenthau in drawing up the plan. Morgenthau then returned to America and was invited by Roosevelt to accompany him to the Second Quebec Conference in September of 1944, which Stalin also did not attend. At this meeting, in the presence of Churchill and Morgenthau, Roosevelt outlined the plan that Morgenthau presented to him, and basically the plan was as follows. Germany was to be turned into an agrarian country, and most of the industrial capacity of Germany was to be transferred to Soviet Russia. 1/4 of the arable land in Germany was to be taken over by communists, and the rest of it was to be divided into 4 districts. Germany was to be divided into areas of control by the Allies. Germans trained and proficient in the industrial arts were to be encouraged to leave voluntarily, and if they did not, they would be forcibly exported out of Germany and sent primarily to Soviet Russia. The rich coal mines of Germany were to be flooded and destroyed. The German people were to be reduced to a level of subsistence so they would never be able to fight another war. One advisor to Roosevelt, Secretary of State Cordell Hull of Tennessee, told Roosevelt that this sounded very similar to the Reconstruction Plan forced upon the South by the North in the American Civil War, which kept them at a subsistence level for about 75 years. And Roosevelt agreed that was a good plan to follow. However, Churchill strongly objected and stated he could never accept such a plan for Germany, and that it would create and cause terrible repercussions in Europe and for England after the war. Morgenthau defended the plan to Churchill, stating that this would eliminate an industrial and trading competitor for England and therefore benefit England financially. That night, Roosevelt and Churchill met alone, and Roosevelt explained to Churchill that he would need to go along with the Morgenthau Plan in order to get further Lend-Lease money and equipment for England and further support from America in the remainder of the war. The next morning, Churchill announced that he had been converted, and he endorsed the plan. The plan was not announced publicly, but Churchill and Roosevelt initialed a memorandum which contained the post-war policy in peace terms. Again, Stalin was not present, but Harry Hopkins was present and approved the plan enthusiastically, and even asked to be the military governor for the Americans to administer the plan. But General Eisenhower was the initial person who filled that position. When Roosevelt returned to Washington and informed his Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, of the plan, Stimson was strongly opposed and stated this would be a disaster. His assistant, John McCloy, who became Mr. Establishment many years later, joined with Stimson in trying to oppose the plan. Finally, McCloy leaked word of the plan to Arthur Kroc of the New York Times, and the matter became a hot campaign issue with Tom Deere during the 1944 presidential campaign. When this became public in October of 1944, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda chief, denounced the Morgenthau blueprint as a Jewish murder plan to exterminate 43 million Germans. Goebbels told the German people that to prevent the Allies from imposing the Morgenthau plan, every house in Germany should resemble a fortress. Goebbels later coupled the Morgenthau plan with Roosevelt's policy of unconditional surrender and told the Germans that they were headed towards extermination unless they resisted to the end. Most probably it was the combination of these two policies which caused the German army to fight so ferociously in the Battle of the Bulge very late in the war when the defeat of Germany was virtually certain. On October 20, 1944, Roosevelt signed a document stating that the plan would not be put into effect after the war. However, Roosevelt met with the British economist John Maynard Keynes in November of 1944 and discussed the Morgenthau Plan with him. Keynes was in America for the Bretton Woods Conference, which established the post-war financial plan to go with the United Nations. Roosevelt told Keynes then that the public statement that the Morgenthau Plan had been abandoned was not true, and that secretly the plan would be implemented after the war. In fact, at the end of the war with Germany, in May of 1945, a slightly changed version of the Morgenthau Plan was signed by President Truman. It was a presidential directive simply labeled as JCH 1067. General Eisenhower administered the plan and was finally replaced by General Lucius Clay. The implementation of the Morgenthau Plan has been hidden from the American public, but two books have now come out about the plan. The most sensational is by James Bach, B-A-C-Q-U-E, entitled Crimes and Mercies, which is cited in your bibliography. The other is a very recent book entitled The Conquerors by Michael Beschloss. Bach gives graphic details and concludes that 5 million Germans starved to death while under Allied government control after the war. In another book by Bach entitled Other Losses, published in 1988, Bach claims that 1.5 million German prisoners of war disappeared into the Soviet Union, never to be heard of again. Bach reveals that far more civilian Germans died in 5 years of peace than the number of German soldiers in 6 years of war. He shows that Eisenhower issued orders that the food supply was to be destroyed and famine created for the Germans beginning in 1945. So this is what it means in the title, Crimes, and then the rest of the title is Mercies. The title Mercies relates to the fact that Truman contacted Herbert Hoover after the war to institute a food plan for Europe, just as Hoover had done after World War I. Bach says that saved maybe 800 million people in Europe from starving. James Bach has stated that it is almost unbelievable that such a program as the Morgenthau Plan could have even been devised, but shocking that it was announced to be canceled but secretly administered, and finally tragic that the enforcement of the plan has been covered up for all these years. Bach's numbers have been challenged by other historians as being too high, and you can see a more moderate approach, although equally disturbing, of the effects of the Morgenthau Plan in the book by Michael Beschloss, that I just mentioned. I had an opportunity to have dinner with Michael Beschloss a few months ago while he was speaking here in Auburn, and we discussed the research he's doing on his next book, which is going to be on the final days and the assassination of Lincoln, which is a subject that interests me greatly. However, I brought up the book Crimes and Mercies by Bach, and Beschloss stated, quote, Bach has his own agenda, end quote. I'm not sure what that means, but other historians have cautioned that Bach's figures may be exaggerated. However, if you cut his figures in half, they show a tremendous crime was committed by Roosevelt, Morgenthau, and Eisenhower. I do not believe that Truman actually understood what he was signing when he signed JCH 1067 in May of 1945, because there's an incident related in the book by Beschloss which describes Truman's visit to post-war Berlin when he attended the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945, which I think indicates this. Truman observed there that the Germans were in a destitute condition, and he was appalled to see the starvation and utter destruction in Berlin. He commented at the time that this brought to mind the stories of his mother had told him of his grandmother after the American Civil War in Missouri. His grandmother and their family home had been completely destroyed by the Union soldiers, and she was left destitute, penniless, and starving. She walked for miles and miles over a long, long period of time in search for just food and shelter. He stated he would never allow anything like that to happen in Germany. Truman fired Morgenthau in July of 1945, and in the winter of 1946, Hoover began his plan to feed Europe. In 1948, the Marshall Plan was put into effect to assist Germany. Therefore, I believe that Truman finally reacted against the Morgenthau Plan once he realized what it was. Now let's look at the very important part of this whole story, and that is the significant resistance movement against Hitler in Germany, which is also left out of most history books today. The policies of unconditional surrender and the Morgenthau Plan had an extremely detrimental effect upon this resistance movement. Allen Dulles was employed by the OSS in Switzerland, which was the organization that preceded the CIA. One of his primary duties was to locate the German underground and see if there was a resistance movement to Hitler. Dulles then wrote a book after the war, which is cited in your bibliography, entitled Germany's Underground. And he tells the heroic story in some detail. Over 800,000 German citizens were put in concentration camps by Hitler because of their resistance to him, and almost all were murdered within a few months before the war ended in May of 1945. And these are just the people that were connected to this particular plot. These resistors were primarily Christians who wanted to remove Hitler to stop the tyranny he had instituted in German people generally. Dulles recounts that he came into contact with this significant movement in 1942, which had begun on a small basis in 1933 when Hitler first took over. The plan had developed over the years and was well developed and revealed to Dulles in 1942. There was a significant number of German military officers and civilians who secretly joined together to propose a new government for Germany to carry out the overthrow of Hitler. The plan was to either capture or to kill Hitler and his key Nazi leaders. And then the new government would take over Germany, negotiate a peace treaty with England and America. Then they would transfer all of their efforts in the war to defeat Stalin and communism in a one-front war. These people feared that if Hitler or Stalin won, that tyranny would result in either case, and that Christian Western civilization would probably be destroyed in Europe and most certainly would be destroyed in Germany. Dulles reported these activities in detail in the plans to Washington and to London. And then in January 1943, Roosevelt announced the Unconditional Surrender policy, which was a complete repudiation of the efforts of these people to overthrow Hitler and try to reach a fair peace with England and America. Roosevelt not only said that the surrender would have to be unconditional, but he said it would have to be made jointly with Russia. And this completely destroyed the plan of the resistance movement to continue the war against communism. Let your imagination grasp the significance of this original plan of resistance and indulge in a little counterfactual history with me. By late November 1941, the German armies had reached the outskirts of Moscow. They'd surrounded Leningrad and had taken most of the Ukraine. The Germans had taken 2 million Soviet prisoners of war and occupied a landmass encompassing 40% of the population of Russia. At this time, the huge Lend-Lease benefits promised to the Soviets by Roosevelt in July of 1941, which was, of course, before America entered the war, had not taken place. And therefore, the German armies were winning the war. However, Hitler had hoped to completely win the war before the Russian winter, but his initial invasion had been delayed. If there had been no unconditional surrender policy and true intelligent statesmen had been in charge of the American and the British governments, think what might have occurred to the rest of the 20th century if cooperation had been given to this movement, if Hitler and the Nazis had been killed, and a new democratic government instituted in Germany. And finally, this new government of Germany then could have continued the war with Stalin, who would not have received any Lend-Lease money or equipment. Germany would not be fighting a two-front war, but only one front, with Stalin as the only enemy. Stalin and his murderous communist leaders and ideas might have been eliminated in Russia by 1942 or 43. And then both communism and Nazism would have been eliminated with very little loss of life to Americans or the British. Instead, the policy of unconditional surrender was announced by Roosevelt in January of 1943 with knowledge that this movement existed and exactly what their plans were. Let's look at the makeup of this movement in a little more detail. It consisted primarily of professional military officers in Germany who were not part of the SS or the private army of Hitler. In fact, the key leader was General Ludwig Beck, who was Hitler's chief of staff of the regular army. Beck had been a strong supporter of Hitler in trying to destroy that part of the Versailles Treaty which disarmed Germany. However, when Hitler began to announce plans to invade Czechoslovakia and Poland, Beck resigned and began to campaign to develop the resistance movement to Hitler. Connected with General Beck was Dr. Karl Gordella, who was the former mayor of Leipzig. He resigned his position as mayor when the Nazis destroyed the statue of the German Jewish composer Felix Mendelssohn in Leipzig, where Mendelssohn had lived for a number of years. Beck was to be the top man and Gordella the second in command of the new government. The movement spread quickly throughout many of the professional military officers who were aware of and committed to the plan as early as 1942. However, the generals were discredited to some extent because of Hitler's success at Munich and then his invasion of Poland, which they had opposed. Finally, a great deal of opposition was made by the professional military officers to Hitler's plan to invade Russia. So Hitler's great successes finally came to an end in the Battle of Stalingrad in January of 1943, which most agree was the turning point of the entire war. At Stalingrad, Hitler demanded that the German Sixth Army fight to the death of the last man rather than make a strategic withdrawal. When Hitler sacrificed the entire Sixth Army unnecessarily, many of the German generals approached Hitler and asked that he give up control of the military operations and turn it over to the generals as Stalin had done, but Hitler refused. It was at this point that the resistance movement began to gather real momentum among the military. Finally, when Africa was lost in May of 43, General Rommel, Germany's greatest and most respected military leader, began to communicate with the resistance movement. Admiral Canaris, who is head of the German intelligence service, where most of the plotting took place, was completely aware of all of the plot and helped it but never actually joined it. Nevertheless, Canaris was connected with it and was eventually put in a concentration camp and killed shortly before the end of the war. Rommel finally became actively involved in the plot after the Allies' successful invasion of Normandy in 1944. But he was wounded in an automobile in which he was riding when it was strafed by an Allied plane. Rommel's popularity with the German people was so great that when Hitler learned that he was part of the plot to have Hitler killed, he could not afford to kill Rommel or put him in a concentration camp. Instead, Rommel was allowed to take poison in a secret suicide that was announced publicly to be a death from his wounds. There's an excellent movie about this starring James Mason, which I've cited in the bibliography, and it's a very accurate portrayal of Rommel's role in the resistance movement. However, there was also a civilian contingent to this, which was headed up by a lawyer and a member of the famous Moltke family. Helmuth von Moltke was the great-grandnephew of the famous general from the Franco-Prussian War. The group met at his estate called Kressau. This was almost entirely a Christian group, which had people from the left and right, and they were responsible for drawing up the plans for the new government to replace Hitler. They came to the conclusion that Christian ethics demanded a socialistic government, so the new government would be democratic, but it would have been socialistic. A much smaller group consisted of university students, and this was called the White Rose Movement. These students did little more than hand out leaflets demanding freedom and protesting the tyranny of Hitler, yet they were ruthlessly murdered by Hitler also. From the beginning to the end of the resistance movement, there were 40 attempts to kill Hitler. The Kressau group had originally objected to participating in the killing of Hitler and advocated merely that he be captured and restrained, but that alternative became impractical as time passed, and it was eventually set aside, and the plot was to kill him. The Gestapo was gradually becoming aware of the people in the resistance movement, and a warrant was actually issued against former Mayor Carl Godello 3 days before the final attempt on Hitler, while Godello was already in hiding. The plan finally culminated on July 20, 1944, when an aristocratic professional soldier and war hero, Colonel Count von Stauffenberg, who had been severely wounded in the war, took the bomb inside of a briefcase into the conference room where Hitler was meeting with his key military officers in East Prussia. Stauffenberg activated the timing device in the briefcase and arranged to have a phone call made to get him out of the room. He went outside and saw the building explode. He saw many bodies being carried out, and one had Hitler's coat over it. So he concluded that Hitler had been killed. He had previously arranged for a plane to fly him directly to Berlin, and upon arriving there, he set out to put the plan into effect, notified General Beck and other officers that Hitler had been killed. Their plan then began to mobilize, but several problems developed. First, the communication center from Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia had not been destroyed as it planned. And secondly, the radio station in Berlin had not been taken over as planned. However, General Beck and Colonel Stauffenberg, thinking Hitler was dead, took over the Nazi headquarters in Berlin and arrested the Nazis and put them under restraint. Word was sent out for the soldiers to rebel and arrest all the other Nazis, and for the army to take over the German government, which began to take place. However, and most importantly, Hitler had not been killed, but only wounded. And at 1 a.m. on the morning of July 21, he came on the radio and announced that he had lived through the attempted assassination. Hitler announced there had been a small group of criminal, ambitious officers who tried to kill him and take over the government. When it became obvious that Hitler was alive and the plot became unraveled, the Nazis resumed control. Stauffenberg was immediately taken out into the courtyard of the Nazi headquarters and shot. General Beck requested that he be allowed to retain his pistol in order to commit suicide, and he was allowed to do so there at the headquarters. Massive arrests then began to take place, and hundreds of thousands of plotters were put into concentration camps along with their friends and relatives and anyone else who was suspected of being a part of the plot. However, Churchill and Roosevelt both adopted Hitler's false propaganda that this was just a small group of ambitious and criminal officers involved in the plot. On the other hand, Stalin appealed to the German people to keep trying to kill Hitler. On Moscow radio, the Russian broadcast stated, quote, "Courageous men rose against Hitler. They have thus begun the signal for the salvation of Germany. The power which he holds can be taken from him only by the German people. Generals, officers, and soldiers, cease fire at once and turn your arms against Hitler. Follow only those who will lead you against Hitler. Do not fail these courageous men." End quote. Allen Dulles, in his book, reports that the unconditional surrender policy greatly impeded the original plans of the resistance movement because many of the Army officers could not see any better condition for them if they were forced to surrender unconditionally to the Russians. Dulles also reported that the bombing of German cities by the British and Americans, which caused high civilian casualties, did not work to discourage the Germans. Instead, it caused the German people and soldiers to have grave doubts about the British and the Americans as liberators. The Russians were not bombing their cities, but the Americans and the British were. The Russians were not talking about unconditional surrender, but the British and the Americans were. Much of the civilian population that was being bombed finally began to look to Hitler as their only protection. Dulles reported he was extremely disappointed in the response from Washington and London about the attempt on Hitler's life, which was dismissed as of no consequence, while the Russians still encouraged rebellion among the Germans. At the end of the book, Dulles finally concluded, quote, "Both Washington and London were fully advised beforehand of all the conspirators were attempting to do, but it sometimes seemed that those who determined policy in America and England were making the military task as difficult as possible by uniting all Germans to resist the bitter end." End quote. A key element of the resistance movement was that the difference between Stalin and Hitler was how they treated their professional armies. Stalin had purged his military before World War II and murdered 35,000 of the senior officers who were suspected of being disloyal, while Hitler had not conducted such a purge, except for the Night of the Long Nights, which is his own private group primarily. Hitler had merely required his officers to take a loyalty oath. Hitler thought that the murder of these 35,000 Russian officers would demoralize the Russian army and make victory over Russia easier. But the Russians still fiercely defended their homeland against the German invasion. Hitler stated toward the end of the war that he made a great mistake in not purging his professional army of its key officers, who became the central part of the resistance movement, which turned on him. America lost a great opportunity in not cooperating with these officers and the civilians who courageously rebelled against Hitler. There's now in Berlin a monument to Count von Stauffenberg, and the name of the street where the Nazi headquarters was and where he was murdered has now been changed to be named for him. This resistance movement is a great and heroic story, coupled with a sorry performance on the part of America and Britain in failing to recognize and cooperate with them. Roosevelt's unconditional surrender policy and the Morgenthau Plan lengthened the war greatly, caused many on both sides to be killed unnecessarily. Of the several books I've listed in the bibliography, one is entitled Plotting Hitler's Death by Joachim Fest. It talks about the huge German losses after July 20, 1944, when the attempted assassination took place. He shows that prior to that event, 2.8 million German soldiers and civilians died during the war. Then after July 20, 1944, and up to the end of the war in May of 1945, a period of only 9.5 months, 4.8 million German soldiers and civilians died. The figure appears even more shocking if we calculate how many were killed on average every day during these two periods of time. Before July 2044, 1,500 Germans were being killed daily. After July 2044, over 16,000 were killed every day. More than 10 times as many people perished, even though the war had obviously been lost. In regard to the Americans, there were nearly 500,000 Americans killed or wounded after D-Day of Normandy invasion in June of 1944. Now let's turn our attention to the unconditional surrender policy as it applied to Japan. Of course, there was no Morgenthal Plan for Japan. I'm not aware of any particular resistance movement in Japan as there was in Germany, but there was a peace party and a war party. The peace party remained under the leadership of Prince Kanoe and the war party under the leadership of Tojo. Prior to the Pearl Harbor attack, Prince Kanoe and his peace party were in power, and Prince Kanoe had offered to come to America and discuss peace plans with Roosevelt. However, Roosevelt refused to see him because at that point, Roosevelt was deceitfully plotting the Pearl Harbor attack. And you can see the details on that in my chapter on reassessing the presidency. As a result of Roosevelt's failure to see Prince Kanoe, the peace party was overthrown and Tojo and his war party took over and bombed Pearl Harbor. However, we know that near the end of the war, January of 1945, Japan was attempting to negotiate a ceasefire and peace treaty with America. A 40-page memorandum was presented by General MacArthur to Roosevelt in January of 1945, which was a month before Roosevelt went to the Yalta Conference in February. This memorandum showed the offer by the Japanese to surrender if they could keep their emperor, and therefore it did not meet the demand for unconditional surrender. MacArthur understood the Japanese culture and their religion, which considered the emperor to be divine or God, and he knew that if they were going to have a successful post-war occupation of Japan and avoid a total disaster, you would need to leave the emperor in place and not treat him as a war criminal. MacArthur recommended to Roosevelt that he abandon the unconditional surrender policy and accept the offer of Japan. Admiral Leahy, who was Roosevelt's chief of staff, was familiar with the proposal and actually had a copy of the 40-page memorandum. Knowing Roosevelt as he did, he suspected that Roosevelt would reject the offer and hide it from the American people, which he did. Therefore, Admiral Leahy presented a copy of the memorandum secretly to Walter Trohan, an important writer for the Chicago Tribune, with the understanding that Trohan would not reveal this memorandum until after the war. Roosevelt, as suspected, ignored the offer and then went to Yalta and negotiated away the advantage that America would have had by the early surrender of Japan. Roosevelt promised further concessions to Russia if they agreed to come into the war 3 months after Germany was defeated. Russia got important land in Manchuria and received massive Lend-Lease money, including the weapons, in June of 1945. Roosevelt died in April 1945, and Truman came in with virtually no knowledge or experience concerning the negotiations. However, we know from Herbert Hoover that he met with Truman in May of 1945, presumably over the program to feed Europe. And Hoover states, Hoover states that he asked Truman if he was aware of the MacArthur Memorandum and Japan's offer to surrender if they could keep their emperor. Truman stated he was aware of it, but he was sticking with the unconditional surrender policy of Roosevelt. You can learn more about this episode and memorandum in a book about Harry Elmer Barnes entitled The Learned Crusader, in a chapter written by Murray Rothbard, which is cited in my bibliography. Walter Trohan wrote about the memorandum after the war ended, as did Harry Elmer Barnes. Finally, at the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945, Truman received word that the atomic bomb test had proven successful. And it was about that time that he ordered the bombs to be dropped on Japan. However, he stated this was not to be done until he had actually left Potsdam and was on his way back to America. So the first bomb was dropped on August 6th while Truman was en route, and he exclaimed, quote, "This is the greatest thing in history," end quote. Russia then entered the war, and the second bomb was dropped a few days later. Russia was in the war for only 6 days, but Russian and Chinese communism were greatly enhanced by our failure to accept the Japanese surrender in January of 1945. Hanson Baldwin states this in his book I cited earlier, quote, "We gave too much to Russia to get her into the war against Japan. We promised Port Arthur and Manchuria, which had always been objects of Russian expansion and ambition. We should have tried to keep Russia out of the war against Japan instead of buying her entry," end quote. During the war, one of the aims expressed was to promise to liberate Korea from Japan. However, in order to get Russia into the war against Japan, Roosevelt gave the communists half of Korea above the 38th parallel. This helped cause the Korean War and still somewhat of a problem today. Finally, the peace treaty of Japan was signed and the emperor was allowed to remain in place, just as the offer had been made in January of 1945, and he was not tried as a war criminal. Military leaders, including Eisenhower and Leahy, had stressed the fact that the firebombing of Japan, which occurred in March of 1945, had rendered the Japanese almost helpless. The series of firebombing in Tokyo over a period of days killed more people than the 2 atomic bombs. Also, the American Navy had completely blockaded Japan by March of 45, which would have starved the Japanese eventually. There was no resistance by the Japanese from the air, and the war was essentially over and lost by Japan in March of 45. Admiral Leahy stated this after the war, quote, "The use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender because of the effective sea blockade and the successful bombing with conventional weapons," end quote. Truman later deceitfully defended his idea of dropping the bombs by stating that the only way to conquer Japan would have been an invasion, which would have cost 1 million American lives. This was just a complete fabrication. Another reason given for dropping the bombs was that we needed to impress the Russians that we had a super deadly weapon to oppose them with, and that Truman would not be the pushover that Roosevelt had been for them. Another reason given was that the secret appropriation of $2 billion that had been made by Congress, the administration needed to justify this expenditure of the taxpayers' money by showing first that the bombs worked and then by claiming that it ended the war early and saved 1 million lives. MacArthur's occupation of Japan resulted in a successful venture primarily because the emperor had been allowed to remain in place. Otherwise, there would have been a bloody occupation force necessary even to subdue the beaten Japanese if we tried to destroy their religion by imprisoning the emperor and trying him as a war criminal. In conclusion, the question must be asked then, why did Roosevelt adopt these horrible policies which were so much against the interest of America and so much in favor of the Soviet Union? Naturally, the answer seems to be that Roosevelt either was a communist or a communist sympathizer. There's little doubt that the only real winner of World War II was communism, both in Russia and in China. The only thing America and Britain did was defeat Hitler and Japan, but Russia acquired tremendous territory in Eastern Europe and Asia, and Soviet Russia was made into a superpower by the Lend-Lease program, the Morgenthal Plan, and the war in general. In the year 2000, a sensational book was published entitled The Venona Secrets, exposing Soviet espionage and American traitors. This book reveals that after 1995, the secret wartime cables, which had been withheld from the public as top secret, were finally released to the public and to historians. These cables now indicate that Joe McCarthy had just scratched the surface of the communist infiltration of the American government under Roosevelt. The most sensational finding is that Harry Hopkins was a direct communist agent known as Agent Number 19. In the book entitled Major Jordan's Diaries, cited in the bibliography, you'll see that Harry Hopkins authorized the nuclear material be sent to Russia during and after the war. Harry Hopkins was the second most powerful man in the American government and a direct agent of the communists. Hopkins lived in the White House and often met with Stalin alone without written instructions from FDR, and privately made commitments to Stalin in Roosevelt's name for America. The book concludes further that Harry Dexter White was a direct agent of the communists and was instrumental not only in the Morgenthau Plan, but also in the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, which tried to set up a new currency and did set up the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, all to help the UN. The book reveals further that Alger Hiss was a direct communist agent and helped to set up the United Nations. Many other key people in the Roosevelt administration are shown to have been direct communist agents with great influence which harmed America. However, in spite of all of this evidence of Roosevelt's sympathies with communism, which are also shown by the New Deal and creating TVA, I don't believe that he was actually a communist. I don't believe that Roosevelt was an ideologist. I don't believe he was a proponent of any particular political philosophy or theory. He was simply a person who believed that the ends justified the means as far as he was concerned. And his own political power and personal fame was the end to be achieved by whatever means brought that about. And that anything was permissible to him regardless of its horrible effects upon America. I'm reminded of an interview with Eleanor Roosevelt, who was asked about the time FDR must have spent in thinking over many of the problems, the momentous decisions he'd made during his 4 terms, which brought about the complete remaking of America through his New Deal and World War II. And Eleanor responded quickly and honestly, quote, "Oh, Franklin doesn't think, he just decides," end quote. I think he was simply a man consumed by political ambition and the desire of personal fame, and was trying to promote himself to being the most important man who'd ever lived. If you will read the book on the UN that I cite in the bibliography entitled FDR and Creation of the UN, which, by the way, is a book praising Roosevelt for creating the UN, you'll see that he had an all-consuming passion to create this world organization. When he ran for vice president in 1920, he made over 800 speeches in praise of the efforts of his hero Woodrow Wilson and the plan for the League of Nations. He was devastated by the fact that the Senate did not approve the Versailles Treaty and allow America to join the League of Nations. He resolved to succeed where his mentor and hero had failed, that is, to create a world organization or world government to bring about world peace. He and Wilson were both consumed by the idea that as President of the United States, they were in a position, if a war occurred, a world war occurred, and America were in it, to try to create such an organization after the war to bring about what they thought or claimed was going to be the goal of world peace. This would undoubtedly have made the man who did this the most important man in the history of the world, and this was Wilson's ambition, and I think it was Roosevelt's ambition. The book points out that when Roosevelt met with Churchill for the Atlantic Charter meeting in August of 1941, that Roosevelt proposed the UN to Churchill. He proposed the four policemen of America, Great Britain, Russia, and China to form a world organization after the war. They would police the world and stop all war. Churchill objected strongly to the idea and stated he would only support a sphere of influence concept. However, Roosevelt held the Lend-Lease strings and got Churchill to agree. Less than 1 month after America entered the war, and on January 1, 1941, a document was signed by Roosevelt and Churchill and representatives of Russia and China to create the UN. And eventually 22 other countries signed to the idea at the same time. When Roosevelt met Stalin for the first time at Tehran Conference, he proposed this UN idea to him, and Stalin also voiced the same objections as Churchill, and further objected to China being one of the four policemen. Roosevelt continued to submit Lend-Lease money and support to Soviet Russia, asking Stalin to do two things: join the war against Japan and support his concept of the UN. It was not until Yalta in February 1945 that Stalin finally agreed to both conditions. Even on the last day of his life, while at Warm Springs, Georgia, Roosevelt's main concern was what he talked about almost incessantly was the UN. He envisioned the meeting with the delegates of the world where he would make the opening address. He even contemplated resigning as president so he could be the leader of the United Nations, which he hoped would be established near his home at Hyde Park. This is all an all-consuming ambition, and he needed a war to create this organization, and he needed Stalin to agree to it. A very interesting assessment of Roosevelt was made by James Burnham after the war, which goes along with my theory and conclusion that it was Roosevelt's ambition that caused him to sell America out to Stalin and communism. Burnham states he believes Roosevelt's mindset was as follows, quote, "With Germany and Japan out of the way, the world could be reorganized for lasting peace and prosperity under the harmonious joint leadership of the United States and the Soviet Union, with Great Britain as a junior stockholder. France and China granted prestige spots on the board of directors, and the little nations given a forum where they could harmoniously blow off steam," end quote. Roosevelt felt that he had completed the work of his hero Woodrow Wilson and established a world organization, which he stated he thought would bring world peace. But he imposed a Carthaginian peace on Germany and Japan, much like the Treaty of Versailles had done in World War I on Germany, thereby aiding the Russian and Chinese communists. The peace imposed by Roosevelt through the various conferences at Casablanca, Quebec, Cairo, Tehran, and Yalta created a far more unstable world than that which existed before. The idea of world government is one of the greatest fears of those who love individual freedom. Much of the blame for the bloody 20th century must be laid at the feet of Wilson and Roosevelt. It was Wilson who initiated America's involvement with European wars and laid the foundations for world organizations. But it was Roosevelt who brought this to fruition and tricked America into World War II through his treason at Pearl Harbor. If we in the 20th century are to avoid the war and bloodshed of the 20th, then the first step is that the American people must learn the truth about these American Caesars and their actions during World War I and World War II. Roosevelt's policies of unconditional surrender and the Morgenthau Plan are two of the true monuments which reveal the infamy of the Roosevelt administration. Lessons cannot be learned from history unless the truth is told. Thank you.